A missing grandmother. The quiet town of Grayson was familiar with routine and tradition. It was a place where neighbors greeted each other every morning, and everyone knew everyone else's business. But when Marion Tate, a 78-year-old grandmother known for her warm-hearted nature and lively spirit, suddenly stopped appearing at her favorite community spots, people noticed. The first to worry was her grandson, Jeremy, a young man who shared a close bond with her. Marion had practically raised him, her kindness and wisdom shaping much of his early life. For Jeremy, she wasn't just family. She was his safe haven. It began with unanswered calls. Marion, a creature of habit, never missed their weekly chats. Every Sunday, like clockwork, she called Jeremy to hear about his week and fill him in on the latest in her quiet life. But 2 Sundays had passed without a word, and Jeremy's texts remained unread. At first, he tried to reason with himself. Maybe she was visiting her friend in the next town, or maybe her phone was simply out of charge. But the lingering silence gnawed at him, raising a worry he couldn't ignore. Jeremy's concern grew, so he called his mother, Ellen, Marion's only child. Ellen lived close to Marion, in a house just a few streets away. But strangely, she didn't seem concerned. She waved off Jeremy's worry with vague reassurances, saying things like, "Your grandmother probably just needed some time to herself," or, "I'm sure she'll reach out soon." Her answers were calm yet evasive, offering no real explanation that would soothe Jeremy's unease. Over the next week, Jeremy tried to press Ellen for answers, calling her multiple times a day, but her responses grew increasingly short and defensive. "Jeremy, she's fine. Don't get all worked up," she would say, clearly annoyed. Her dismissive tone only heightened his suspicions. It wasn't like Ellen to brush things off. She'd always been a protective daughter. But now her lack of urgency felt odd. He remembered how, in the past, his mother had taken the slightest hint of an illness in Marion very seriously, immediately arranging doctor visits. Why, then, did she seem so indifferent now? Unable to quell his rising fear, Jeremy took matters into his own hands. He went to the local police station and filed a missing persons report. The officers listened as he explained his close relationship with his grandmother, the countless calls gone unanswered, and his mother's strange reaction. Though they assured him they'd look into it, they seemed to think it was just a case of an elderly woman who might have gone off somewhere to clear her mind. But Detective Sarah Burke, known for her attention to detail and sharp instincts, took a particular interest in the case. She'd been working in Grayson for over a decade and knew that in a town like this, small things often led to larger, hidden truths. She agreed to visit Ellen's house to ask a few questions and see if there was anything more to Marion's disappearance. Ellen greeted the detective with a tight smile, her eyes slightly widened, as if surprised by the sudden attention. She ushered Sarah into the neat living room, decorated with family photos on every wall. Marion's face, beaming with warmth, looked down at them from various frames, capturing her essence. Sarah began with routine questions. When had Ellen last seen her mother? Had Marion mentioned going somewhere? Ellen repeated the same lines she told Jeremy. "Oh, she's just taking some time away, I think. She's always been independent." The detective observed Ellen's demeanor closely. Her words were careful, but there was an underlying tension, a stiffness to her body language that made Sarah suspicious. Detective Burke knew something was off. Every answer seemed rehearsed, as if Ellen were sticking to a script. She noted the way Ellen's gaze would occasionally dart to the hallway whenever Sarah probed further, as though worried someone else might overhear. Detective Burke left the house with more questions than answers. Something about the visit unsettled her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Ellen was hiding something. She decided to investigate Marion's life further, hoping to find a clue that might explain her disappearance. The next day, Sarah visited Marion's friends and neighbors, searching for anyone who had seen or heard from her in the past few weeks. Most had nothing to offer, but a few mentioned noticing some tension between Marion and her daughter. Marion was upset about something. One neighbor confided, She wouldn't tell me exactly, but I could tell it was eating at her. She seemed distant, like her mind was elsewhere. Curious and determined, Detective Burke decided it was time for a second visit to Ellen's house, this time with a request to search the property. Ellen's demeanor shifted as soon as the detective mentioned a search. She grew pale and defensive, her earlier calm unraveling. "I don't understand why this is necessary," she protested, but she eventually relented, her reluctance only fueling Burke's suspicions. The house was neat, but as Sarah reached the garage, she felt a chill. Unlike the rest of the property, the garage seemed untouched, cluttered with old boxes and unused tools. It was dark, the only light coming from a small bowl hanging in the corner, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Sarah's eyes were drawn to a large, locked trunk, partially hidden by a blanket in the far corner. When she asked Ellen about the trunk, her reaction was immediate. "Oh, that's just some old junk of my mother's," she stammered, her voice tight. But her attempt at nonchalance fell flat. Sarah could see her fidgeting, her hands twisting together in a gesture of anxiety. After a brief struggle to find the right tools, Detective Burke managed to pry the trunk open. As she lifted the lid, a thick, pungent smell filled the air, causing her to recoil. She shone her flashlight inside, and there, wrapped in layers of cloth and hidden in the darkness, lay the unmistakable form of a body. The discovery turned the quiet, cozy home into a scene of horror. Marion's lifeless form lay at the bottom of the trunk, a woman who had been loved and cherished by those who knew her. Now her absence was explained, but the question of why and how remained. Ellen's calm facade shattered as she was taken into custody, her face a mask of shock, her previously rehearsed answers now hollow and meaningless. As officers moved in to secure the scene, Detective Burke knew this case had just begun. This was no ordinary family drama. The hidden darkness within the Watson family would soon come to light, exposing a web of lies and betrayal that had been carefully concealed for years. Shadows of betrayal. Detective Sarah Burke had seen many unsettling things in her career, but the scene in Ellen's garage haunted her as she left the property that evening. The air was thick with questions. How could a loving grandmother like Marion, whose kindness had been woven into the fabric of the community, meet such a tragic end in her own daughter's house? And why had Ellen tried so desperately to hide her mother's body? As Burke replayed the details in her mind, she knew there was far more to uncover. Back at the precinct, Burke gathered her team. Evidence bags containing Marion's personal belongings were laid out on the table, a grim display that underscored the gravity of the case. Among the items found near Marion's body was a worn notebook, its pages filled with dates and small notes in Marion's handwriting. Most entries seemed ordinary, reminders to water the plants, grocery lists, appointments. But a few lines stood out, cryptic and unsettling. "Spoke to Ellen. She's distant cold. Something is wrong, but she won't say. Paul looked at me strangely today. What's going on? Saw them together. It's wrong, it's so wrong." Each entry hinted at a hidden tension, an unspoken conflict that had haunted Marion in her final days. Burke knew these notes were clues, breadcrumbs left behind by a woman who had sensed a storm brewing within her family. But what had Marion seen, or perhaps discovered, that led to her tragic fate? As Burke pored over the notebook, an officer knocked on her door. "Detective, there's something you need to see," he said, holding up a photograph from a different evidence bag. It was a small, faded picture of Ellen, smiling, her arm draped around a man who was not her husband. The man was Officer Jack Keller, a colleague of Ellen's husband, Hall, and a well-known figure in town. Jack was married, with 3 children of his own, yet here he was, locked in a seemingly intimate moment with Ellen. The implications were immediate and troubling. Burke's mind raced. If Marion had discovered Ellen's affair with Jack, it would explain her notes and perhaps her anxiety in the final weeks. But it didn't explain why Ellen had gone to such lengths to conceal her mother's death. Did she fear that Marion might expose the affair? Or was there something darker still lurking beneath the surface? The following day, Burke visited Paul Watson, Ellen's husband, at the precinct where he worked as a patrol officer. Paul had been silent during most of the investigation, deferring to Ellen's explanations and showing little emotion. As Burke walked into the small, cluttered office, Paul sat stiffly at his desk, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for meeting with me, Paul," Burke began, taking a seat across from him. She studied his face, watching for any hint of emotion. "I know this has been a difficult time, and I'm sure you have questions of your own. But I need to know, did you have any idea about Ellen's relationship with Jack Keller?" For the first time, Paul's composure cracked. His eyes narrowed, and a faint flush crept up his neck. "What are you talking about?" he replied, his voice low but strained. "Ellen wouldn't. She wouldn't do that." Burke placed the photograph on the table, watching Miss Paul's gaze fell on it. He stared at the image, his hand trembling slightly, as if he were seeing a ghost. A silence fell over the room, heavy and painful. "I suspected something," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's been distant, secretive. But I never thought she would, with Jack, of all people." His words trailed off, and he looked away, lost in thought. Burke's eyes softened, but she pressed on. "Did Marion know about the affair?" she asked. Paul's head snapped up. "Marion." His voice shook with a mix of surprise and guilt. "She was close with Ellen, closer than anyone. But I don't think she knew. At least, not until recently. She started visiting us more, watching Ellen, asking her strange questions. Ellen would get angry, told her to stop meddling." He paused, swallowing hard. Maybe that's why this happened. As Burke left the precinct, she couldn't shake the feeling that Paul knew more than he was letting on. His shock had been real, but there was something else, a layer of guilt beneath his words. What secrets was he hiding? Back at the office, Burke ordered a deeper dive into Marion's recent activity. Phone records showed multiple calls between Marion and Paul in the weeks leading up to her death. Why had they been talking so much? And what had been so urgent that Marion felt the need to call her son-in-law repeatedly? The next day, Detective Burke decided to speak with Jack Keller. She tracked him down at a small diner on the edge of town, where he often ate breakfast before his shift. When Burke walked in, he was seated at the counter, his face buried in a newspaper. He looked up as she approached, his expression shifting from casual interest to guarded caution. "Detective Burke," he greeted her, forcing a smile. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Burke slid into the seat beside him, her gaze steady. "I think you know why I'm here, Jack," she replied. "We found some things that suggest you and Ellen were close." Jack's smile faltered, and he glanced around nervously. "Look, it's not what you think," he began, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Ellen and we've known each other a long time. It's just friendship, nothing more." Burke raised an eyebrow, pulling out the photograph and placing it on the counter. Jack's face went pale as he stared at the image, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for words. "All right, we were involved," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "But it's over. It ended months ago. She was struggling with her family, with everything. She just needed someone to talk to." "Did Marion know about your relationship?" Burke pressed. Jack hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know. Ellen thought her mother suspected something, but Marion never confronted us. I never would have done anything to hurt her. She was a good woman." His voice cracked, and he looked away, as if haunted by the memory. Burke studied him, noting the way his hands trembled as he spoke. Jack might be telling the truth about the affair being over, but there was a nervousness about him, a sense of fear that went beyond mere guilt. "Did Ellen ever talk about her mother's suspicions?" Burke asked, pressing further. Jack shook his head. "She mentioned it once or twice, but she brushed it off. Said her mother was just old-fashioned, that she didn't understand." He paused, his expression darkening. "But a few weeks before this, Ellen became more frantic, more anxious. She said Marion was prying, asking too many questions. She started talking about drastic measures. Drastic measures. Burke's pulse quickened. What kind of measures? Jack looked away, his voice barely a whisper. She didn't say, but I could tell she was scared. Scared that her mother would ruin everything. She was desperate, but I didn't think. I never thought it would come to this. Detective Burke left the diner, her mind spinning. She knew she was closer to the truth, but the pieces weren't fully fitting yet. Ellen's affair with Jack, Marion's suspicions, and Paul's hidden guilt. It was all part of a web of lies that had spiraled out of control. Later that day, Burke received a call from the forensic lab. Detective Burke, we analyzed the fibers found on Marion's body. They match a rug from Ellen's living room. The voice on the other end was steady, but the implications were chilling. Marion had been killed in her own daughter's house, her body wrapped in fabric that Ellen had likely chosen herself. As Burke stood in the precinct, the evidence clear before her, she felt a pang of sadness. Marion Tate had died, a victim of her family's secrets and betrayals. But Burke was determined that her death would not go unpunished. She gathered her notes, preparing to confront Ellen one last time. The time for deception was over. It was time to bring the truth to light. The walls close in. Detective Sarah Burke had dealt with dark cases before, but there was something particularly unsettling about the secrets surrounding Marion Tate's death. The image of the gentle grandmother, hidden away in a locked trunk in her daughter's garage, lingered in her mind, a haunting reminder of just how deeply betrayal could wound. Back at the precinct, Burke spent hours reviewing every scrap of evidence they had so far. Ellen's evasiveness, Jack's fear, Paul's guilt. All these details painted a murky picture, but still, the motive eluded her. What had truly driven Ellen to such desperate lengths? Had the affair with Jack simply tipped her over the edge, or was there something even deeper at play? As she combed through Marion's belongings, Burke noticed something she had initially overlooked. A small, nearly faded photo tucked inside Marion's journal. It was of a young girl, perhaps 7 or 8, with Marion holding her close. The girl's face bore a striking resemblance to Ellen, but the handwriting on the back read, "To my dearest Susan, always in my heart." Burke felt a chill. Who was Susan? And why had Marion kept this photo hidden? Intrigued, Burke reached out to Marion's closest friend, a woman named Edith, who had known her for over 40 years. Edith was a fixture in Grayson, one of those people who seemed to know everyone's business, even if they never asked her to. If anyone could shed light on this mystery, it would be her. Burke met Edith at her small, cluttered home on the edge of town. Edith was waiting for her on the porch, a cup of tea in her hand, and a look of knowing sympathy in her eyes. "Thank you for coming, Edith," Burke said, taking the seat beside her. "I have some questions about Marion's past, specifically about someone named Susan." Edith sighed, setting her teacup down with a sad smile. "Susan was Marion's first child," she said softly, as if revealing a long-held secret. "Marion gave birth to her when she was very young, just barely out of her teens. But Susan didn't stay with Marion. Well, the details were always fuzzy, but the child was taken from her. Marion was devastated, of course. It was years before she could even speak about it." Burke's heart sank. A lost child, a hidden sorrow. Could this be the key to Marion's fate? "Do you think Ellen knew about Susan?" Burke asked, leaning in. Edith nodded slowly. "I think she found out as a teenager. Marion tried to keep it a secret, you see, but Ellen was curious. She found an old letter one day and confronted her mother. Marion was honest with her, but the revelation drove a wedge between them. Ellen saw it as a betrayal, a part of her mother's life that didn't include her. And from that day on, their relationship was never quite the same. This revelation changed everything. Ellen's resentment toward her mother wasn't just rooted in recent events. It had been festering for years, a wound that time had only deepened. Marian's efforts to reconnect had likely only reminded Ellen of that hidden past, a past that didn't include her. With new clarity, Burke returned to the precinct and pulled up Ellen's phone records. She noticed something unusual. Multiple calls between Ellen and a mysterious number registered under the name Geneva West. A quick background check revealed that Geneva was a private investigator based 2 towns over, specializing in family history research. What had Ellen been trying to uncover? The next morning, Burke drove out to meet Geneva. She found her in a small office lined with filing cabinets and overflowing with case files. Geneva greeted her with a wary smile, her sharp eyes assessing Burke in an instant. "I was wondering when someone would come asking about that," Geneva said, gesturing for Burke to sit. "Ellen Watson contacted me a few months ago. She wanted information on a woman named Susan Hartman. Said it was personal business. I didn't ask too many questions." "Did you find anything for her?" Burke asked, her pulse quickening. Geneva pulled a folder from her desk, flipping through pages. "I traced Susan's movements through the years," she said, showing Burke records of addresses, photos, and documents. "Turns out Susan had settled in Grayson under a new name about 10 years ago. She was hiding in plain sight, living just a few blocks from Marion. I told Ellen this, but she didn't seem surprised. In fact, she looked furious." Burke felt her blood run cold. Susan, Marion's long-lost daughter, had been living in the same town, just within reach. Marion had found her, quietly reconnecting with her past. But if Ellen had learned about her half-sister, and if Marion had rekindled that relationship, it could have reignited old resentments in Ellen, a jealousy that ran deeper than any affair. With a heavy heart, Burke returned to Grayson, realizing that the tangled roots of Marion's murder lay in this hidden family history. It was a shocking motive, one few would understand. Ellen had felt like a shadow in her own mother's life, a child left to live in the wake of a lost daughter. When Burke arrived at Ellen's home that evening, she found Ellen sitting on her front steps, her eyes red-rimmed, as though she hadn't slept in days. She didn't look surprised to see Burke. "I knew you'd be back," Ellen said softly, her voice hollow. She gestured to the steps beside her, inviting Burke to sit. "I figured it was only a matter of time." Burke took a seat, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. "I know about Susan," Burke began, watching Ellen's reaction carefully. Ellen's face twisted with a mixture of anger and sadness. "So now you understand," she replied bitterly. "My mother, she never let go of Susan. Even after all these years, she held on to her. And I was never enough. I was just the second choice." The bitterness in Ellen's voice was unmistakable, a depth of resentment that had clearly haunted her for years. "You felt like she loved Susan more than you," Burke said, trying to empathize. Ellen's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. "She didn't even tell me that she'd found Susan. She kept it a secret, like it was some special bond only they shared. When I confronted her about it, she just looked at me, like I was the one intruding. I was her daughter too, but she pushed me aside for a stranger." Burke listened quietly, understanding the pain that must have consumed Ellen. But it didn't justify what she'd done. "Is that why you killed her?" Burke asked gently, her voice tinged with sadness. Ellen looked down at her hands, twisting them together as she searched for the right words. "I didn't mean for it to happen. We were arguing, and she said things that broke me. She told me that I was selfish, that I was too controlling. She said I was just like my father, that I couldn't handle her being happy. I lost control." The weight of Ellen's confession hung heavy in the air. She looked up at Burke, her face a mixture of defiance and sorrow. "It wasn't supposed to end like this. I just wanted her to love me, to finally see me. But I guess I was never enough." Burke placed a comforting hand on Ellen's shoulder, both as a detective and as someone who had seen the devastating effects of unresolved pain. She knew Ellen's actions would haunt her, just as Marion's ghost would haunt the town. Later that night, Burke sat alone in her office, thinking of Marion and the secret she had carried. the fractured family she had left behind. It was a sad story, a tragic end that neither love nor reconciliation could mend. But at least now, the truth was out. Marian's memory would no longer be buried in lies, and Grayson could begin to heal from the wounds inflicted by generations of secrets. The consequences of truth. Detective Sarah Burke had worked many cases in her time, but none weighed as heavily on her as the unraveling of the Tate family's hidden history. Marian's death, the buried secrets of a long-lost daughter, and Ellen's festering resentment. All of it had woven a tragedy that defied easy explanation. But despite Ellen's confession, Burke knew that something was still missing. Ellen's story didn't fully account for the way Marian's body had been concealed or the cold, methodical planning it would have taken to hide her mother's death for so long. There had to be more to the story, and Burke wasn't about to let it go. After returning to the precinct, Burke went over every detail of Ellen's confession, her mind dissecting every sentence, every shift in her tone. Ellen's resentment, her anger, her desperate need for recognition, all of it made sense, but there was an underlying darkness Burke hadn't yet touched. She called her partner, Detective Jim Alvarez, a seasoned investigator with an eye for the details most people missed. "Jim, something about this doesn't sit right with me," Burke began, leaning over her desk, her fingers tracing the lines of Ellen's recorded statement. She confessed to killing her mother in a fit of rage, but hiding the body so meticulously. The trunk, the way it was sealed, it feels too calculated. And then there's Jack, her lover. I can't shake the feeling he's involved somehow. Alvarez nodded, his brows furrowing in thought. I had the same thought, Sarah. Hiding a body that well. It's the kind of thing you'd need help with. We've seen enough cases to know that crimes of passion rarely involve that level of planning. Plus, Jack's been slippery since we started digging. We know he's hiding something. Burke and Alvarez decided it was time to bring Jack back in for questioning. The next day, they met him in an interview room at the precinct. Jack sat across from them, his posture tense, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. Jack, we need to talk about Ellen's confession, Burke began, her voice steady but unyielding. We have reason to believe you may have helped her after Marian's death. And if you did, it's better to come clean now than have us find out on our own. Jack's face paled further, a flicker of fear flashing in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but his words faltered, caught in his throat. You're not doing yourself any favors by staying quiet, Alvarez added, his tone firm. We're aware of your relationship with Ellen, and we know she confided in you. So why don't you tell us exactly what she asked you to do? Jack hesitated, his hands clenching in his lap. For a moment, he seemed ready to deny everything. But finally, he let out a long, defeated sigh. All right, he muttered, his voice barely audible. I helped her, but I didn't know it would go this far. He leaned back in his chair, his shoulders slumping as he began to speak. Ellen called me the night Marian died. She was hysterical, said it was an accident, that she and Marian had argued, and her mother had fallen, hit her head. I didn't know what to think. Ellen was always so tightly wound. I'd seen her get angry before, but nothing like this. She said she couldn't go to the police, that they'd never believe it was an accident. Jack looked down, as if ashamed of his own weakness. She begged me to help her cover it up. I was stupid. I didn't know what to do, so I went over to the house. We wrapped her up, put her in the trunk. Ellen kept saying it was temporary, that she just needed time to figure things out. And you didn't stop to think what would happen if someone found out? Burke asked, her voice laced with disappointment. Jack's face twisted in anguish. I know it was wrong. But Ellen, she's different. She has this way of getting under your skin, of making you feel like you owe her something. I thought I was helping her, that maybe we could fix it somehow. Alvarez shook his head, his expression grim. And what about Susan? Jack's head snapped up, genuine surprise flickering in his eyes. Susan, I don't know what you mean. We know Ellen discovered Marion had reconnected with her first daughter, Susan, Burke pressed. Did Ellen ever talk to you about that? Jack shook his head, visibly bewildered. No, she never mentioned it. I knew Ellen and Marion had a complicated relationship, but I didn't know there was anyone else. Burke exchanged a glance with Alvarez. If Jack didn't know about Susan, then perhaps he hadn't been as deeply involved in Ellen's vendetta as they'd initially thought. But it still left the question. Had Ellen's hatred for her mother, fueled by years of feeling second best, been enough to drive her to murder? As the detectives left the interview room, Burke's mind turned to Susan. It was time to speak to her directly, to hear her side of the story. She needed to understand the true depth of Ellen's jealousy and bitterness. She tracked Susan down to a modest house on the outskirts of Grayson, a small, unassuming place surrounded by a neatly kept garden. When Susan opened the door, Burke was struck by her resemblance to Marion. The same warmth in her eyes, the same gentle smile. Detective Burke, Susan greeted her, a hint of apprehension in her voice. I thought someone might come eventually. Burke stepped inside, the living room filled with framed photos and a comforting scent of freshly brewed tea. She took a seat across from Susan, who regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and sadness. I'm here about your mother, Burke began gently. And about Ellen. Susan's face softened, though a shadow passed over her eyes. I heard. What happened to her? She said quietly. My mother was a kind woman, but she had her share of pain. I think she was trying to heal some of that pain by reconnecting with me. But Ellen, she never accepted it. Susan paused, her gaze dropping to her hands. When Ellen found out about me, she was furious. She came here, once, unannounced. She accused me of trying to steal our mother from her, of trying to claim what was hers. I tried to tell her it wasn't like that, but she didn't listen. She said terrible things, things I can't forget. What did she say? Burke asked, leaning forward. Susan's eyes filled with tears, her voice wavering. She told me I was a mistake, that I should have stayed gone. She said our mother had chosen her life with Ellen, that I was nothing but a ghost from a past that should have stayed buried. I think she was jealous, in a way. That our mother wanted to include me, after all those years. Burke listened in silence, the pieces of Ellen's resentment falling into place. She'd felt abandoned, overshadowed by a sister she'd never known, who now loomed as a reminder of her mother's hidden past. To Ellen, Marion's attempts to reunite with Susan must have felt like a betrayal, a mother choosing a daughter she'd lost over the one who'd stayed. As Burke stood to leave, Susan touched her arm. Detective, she said softly, I know what Ellen did was unforgivable, but I also know that she's in pain. She's lived with the weight of that resentment her whole life. I don't think she ever knew how to let it go. Burke nodded, touched by Susan's compassion. Even after everything, Susan seemed to hold no hatred for her half-sister, a quiet strength that Burke found deeply moving. Returning to the precinct, Burke reflected on the tangled mess of love, jealousy, and resentment that had destroyed the Tate family. Marion's love for her daughters had been real, but it had been fractured by time and hidden histories. Ellen's life had been shaped by the ghost of a sister she'd never known, and when that sister re-entered the picture, it shattered the fragile peace Ellen had built for herself. Later that evening, Burke filed her final report, the pieces of the case now fitting together with painful clarity. Ellen had killed Marion not out of cold calculation, but out of a lifetime of bottled anger and resentment. And Jack, ensnared by Ellen's desperation, had been drawn into her web of lies. As Burke turned off the lights in her office, she took a deep breath, the weight of the case still heavy on her shoulders. She knew there were no winners here, no one who would walk away unscarred. Ellen would pay for her crime, but the true punishment was the life she'd condemned herself to, a life spent in the shadow of her own bitterness. The following morning, Burke watched as Ellen was led away in handcuffs, her face pale and expressionless. Jack, too, would face consequences for his part in the cover-up, though his role had been born of weakness rather than malice. In the end, Burke hoped that Susan would find some measure of peace in the wake of her mother's death. Marion had tried to make things right, to mend the past, but the scars were too deep, the wounds too fresh. As Burke drove home that evening, she found herself thinking about her own family, the quiet fractures that could so easily turn to breaks. She thought of the secrets people kept, the things they left unsaid, and the walls they built to protect themselves from pain. But as she had learned from this case, those walls could become prisons, traps that held the past in an unyielding grip, unraveling the final threads. The town of Grayson had always prided itself on being close-knit, where families stuck together through thick and thin. But in the days following Ellen's arrest, the town's familiar warmth seemed to dim, replaced by hushed whispers and sidelong glances. The tragedy surrounding Marion's death had shaken the townsfolk to their core as they struggled to reconcile the horrifying truth with the family they thought they knew. Detective Sarah Burke felt the weight of that judgment every time she walked through Grayson. People stopped her on the street, asking quiet, cautious questions, wanting to understand what had gone wrong with the Watson family. They expected answers that would ease their discomfort, but Burke had none to offer. The story was one of bitterness and resentment, of buried secrets that had festered for decades. It was not a story that brought comfort. It was a cautionary tale, a reminder of what could happen when pain was allowed to simmer unchecked. Ellen had been placed in county jail, awaiting her first hearing, and Detective Burke had moved on to other cases, but something still tugged at her mind, an uneasy feeling that not everything had been laid to rest. Though Ellen's confession explained much of Marion's tragic end, Burke couldn't shake the feeling that another piece of the puzzle was missing. Late one night, as Burke sifted through Ellen's records, she found something unusual. An out-of-town call Ellen had made just days before Marion's death. It had been to a number that didn't appear on any previous records, a single call to a number registered to a private cell under the name Carl Benson. A quick search through local law enforcement databases revealed that Carl Benson was a man with a long record: fraud, intimidation, and several accusations of problem-solving work for people in difficult situations. He was a known fixer, someone who dealt with troublesome problems for the right price. Burke felt a chill run down her spine. Had Ellen hired someone to intimidate or even harm Marion? And if so, why? Ellen had claimed her mother's death was the result of a heated argument, a moment of unplanned violence. But if she'd called Carl Benson, that story might be a lie designed to downplay the premeditated nature of her crime. Burke decided to follow the lead, hoping it would give her the answers she needed. She reached out to the state police and arranged to bring Carl in for questioning. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Carl had a reputation for stonewalling police, and his years of evading legal trouble had made him a master of playing the system. But Burke was determined. This case had gone too far, and too many lives had been shattered. She wouldn't allow Ellen or anyone else to evade justice. The following day, Carl Benson sat across from Burke in the same interrogation room where she had questioned Jack and Ellen. He was a wiry man with sharp eyes, his face lined with years of experience in dodging the law. His gaze was calm, almost amused, as if he'd been through this routine 100 times before. "Detective Burke," he said smoothly, his voice tinged with a mockery that made her skin crawl. "I understand you've got some questions for me." Burke didn't rise to his bait. She simply placed a photo of Marion in front of him, her expression unreadable. "Carl, I think you know why you're here. This woman, Marion Tate, died in suspicious circumstances, and just days before her death, her daughter, Ellen, called you. Care to tell me why?" Carl glanced at the photo, his expression indifferent. "I don't see how that concerns me," he replied, shrugging casually. "I get calls from people all the time. Sometimes they need a favor, but that doesn't mean I go around hurting people." Burke leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "We have reason to believe Ellen hired you to intimidate her mother. Maybe she thought Marion was a threat, Or maybe she just wanted her out of the picture. Either way, we think you're involved. And if you don't cooperate, I'll make sure the DA has a nice long list of your past offenses to go through. Carl's smile faltered, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Look, detective, he said, shifting in his seat. Ellen did call me, but it was just to talk. She was upset, said her mother was causing problems for her family. She wanted advice, that's all. I told her I didn't get involved in family disputes. I'm not stupid. I know better than to get mixed up in something like this. Burke watched him carefully, noting the nervous twitch in his jaw. And you expect me to believe that? You have a record of intimidation, Carl. Why would she come to you just for advice? Carl hesitated, his gaze darting to the door, as if calculating an escape. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping. All right, fine. She wanted her mother gone. Said the old lady was ruining everything, and that she couldn't keep dealing with it. She didn't ask me to kill her, but she wanted me to. I don't know, scare her. Make her leave town. Burke's stomach churned. Ellen's anger had been deeper than even she had suspected. Hiring a man like Carl to intimidate Marion was more than an act of desperation. It was an act of cold calculation, a willingness to do whatever it took to rid herself of her mother's influence. And did you follow through? Burke asked, her voice low. Carl shook his head. No, I didn't. I may not be a saint, but I don't go after old ladies. I told her she was on her own. And that was the end of it. She was angry, but I walked away. Burke studied his face, trying to discern the truth. She sensed that Carl wasn't lying. His type rarely took on jobs that didn't come with high stakes or big pay. Still, his involvement cast a new light on Ellen's motives. Marion's death wasn't just a spontaneous act of rage. It was the culmination of months of calculated planning, a descent into darkness driven by jealousy and bitterness. Burke leaned back in her chair, nodding at Alvarez, who had been watching the interview from the other side of the glass. It was time to confront Ellen with what they had uncovered. Burke knew that Ellen's story would crumble under the weight of the new evidence, and that the full truth, finally, would be brought to light. When Burke entered Ellen's cell later that day, she found her pacing, her face pale and drawn. Ellen looked up, her eyes narrowing as she saw Burke's expression. Ellen, Burke began, her tone unyielding, we know about Carl Benson. We know you asked him to intimidate your mother. And we know that your so-called accident was anything but. You planned this. You didn't just lose control. You were willing to do whatever it took to remove her from your life. Ellen's face twisted, a mixture of fury and fear. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered, though her voice wavered. Burke stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. You can stop lying, Ellen. We have Carl's statement. He admitted you wanted your mother gone, and he turned you down. So you took matters into your own hands. Don't you see? Every lie, every cover-up, it only makes things worse. You have one chance to tell the truth. Ellen's shoulders sagged, her defiance crumbling. She sank onto the cot, her face in her hands. Fine, she whispered, her voice broken. I hated her. I hated the way she made me feel. Like I was never good enough. Like I was a placeholder for the daughter she really wanted. And then Susan came back, and it was like I was invisible. All those years of being her only child, and suddenly I was nothing. Ellen looked up, her face twisted in anguish. I thought if I could make her go away, if I could just scare her, things would go back to normal. But that night, she told me I was selfish, that I'd never understand. She said Susan was her real family, that I'd never have that place in her heart. I snapped. I didn't mean to, but I did. I couldn't stop myself. Burke listened in silence, feeling the weight of Ellen's confession settle around them. It was a sad, twisted tragedy. A woman consumed by jealousy, willing to destroy her own family to quiet the pain inside her. As Burke left Ellen's cell, she knew the case was finally closed. Ellen would face justice, but it was a hollow victory. The truth had come too late to save anyone, and in the end, there were only broken lives left in the wake of Marian's death. The people of Grayson would remember this tragedy for years to come, a dark stain on their small town. And Burke, as she walked into the fading daylight, hoped that somehow, in the silence that followed, the Tate family might find a way to heal from the wounds that had torn them apart. After the storm, the small town of Grayson was slowly adjusting to the aftermath of Marian Tate's tragic death and Ellen's confession. Though the legal proceedings were far from over, Detective Sarah Burke had wrapped up her investigation. The case had left a mark on her, a mix of sadness and exhaustion, the kind that clings to a person long after the facts are put on paper. For Burke, solving the case hadn't brought closure. It had only revealed the fragility of family bonds, the dark places resentment could reach if left unchecked. As she sat at her desk, finishing her final report on Marian's case, a call came in from an unexpected source. Susan. Burke had left her card with Marian's first daughter in case he ever wanted to talk. Apparently, Susan had decided it was time. Burke met her at a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town, a quiet place where they could speak without interruption. When Susan arrived, she carried an air of sorrow, her once warm eyes dulled by grief. "Detective Burke," she greeted, sitting across from her. "Thank you for meeting me." "Of course, Susan," Burke replied, her tone gentle. "How are you holding up?" Susan managed a sad smile, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup as though it might anchor her. "I don't know if you ever hold up after something like this," she murmured, her gaze distant. I keep wondering if I'd never come back to Grayson. Maybe none of this would have happened. Maybe Marian would still be alive." Burke shook her head, sensing the guilt that weighed heavily on Susan. "You can't blame yourself for this. You came back because you wanted to know your mother, to fill in those missing pieces of your life. That's not a crime, Susan. It's not your fault that Ellen couldn't let go of her resentment." Susan sighed, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. "Ellen and I never really knew each other, but I can see now that she's been living with this bitterness her entire life. I just didn't realize how deep it went. I thought maybe we could find a way to be a family, but I was too naive." As they talked, Burke sensed there was something else Susan wanted to discuss, something she'd been holding back. "Is there something else you wanted to tell me?" Burke asked gently, watching her carefully. Susan looked away, her expression conflicted. Finally, she took a shaky breath and said after the funeral, "I went to Marian's house. She'd left me a letter, hidden in a drawer in her bedroom. I think she knew that she might not have much time left." Burke leaned forward, her interest piqued. "What did the letter say?" Susan hesitated, then reached into her bag, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "She wrote that she was sorry for all the pain she caused me, and for the pain she'd caused Ellen by keeping us apart. She wrote about how she regretted the choices she'd made, but that she thought it was too late to make things right. She said she'd tried to keep the peace, to protect Ellen from the truth, but she didn't realize how much damage it had done." A tear slipped down Susan's cheek as she continued. "Marian wrote that if anything happened to her, she wanted me to forgive Ellen. She didn't want our family to be torn apart by more anger and resentment. She hoped that maybe, someday, we could find a way to heal." Burke felt a pang of sadness for Marian, a woman who had spent her life carrying the weight of her own decisions, only to find her final wish shattered. She reached across the table, placing a comforting hand over Susan's. "You're a strong woman, Susan, and your mother wanted you to carry on, not to let this tragedy define you." Susan looked up, her gaze steady. "I want to honor her memory, Detective Burke. I don't know how I'll ever forgive Ellen, but I don't want to carry that bitterness. I don't want to end up like her." Burke nodded, a sense of respect growing within her. Susan had lost her mother twice, once in childhood and once again in this horrific tragedy. But somehow, she'd found the strength to try and move forward, to find a path that didn't end in darkness. As they parted ways, Burke reflected on the power of Marian's words, and the wisdom she'd imparted even in her absence. Grayson would forever be marked by this tragedy, but perhaps there was hope yet for healing, a small light in the shadow that had engulfed the Tate family. The days turned into weeks, and Burke found herself thinking less and less about the Tate case, though it had left an indelible mark on her perspective. Her usual caseload began to pick up again, and soon she was entrenched in the familiar routines of her work. But every now and then, she would catch a glimpse of Susan around town, her presence a quiet reminder of resilience. Meanwhile, Ellen's trial approached, and Grayson's interest in the case was rekindled. Newspapers covered the story with somber headlines, townsfolk whispered behind closed doors, and Ellen's name became a fixture of local gossip. People struggled to reconcile the loving daughter they thought they knew with the woman who had harbored such deep-seated anger and had committed such a horrifying crime. The courtroom was filled to capacity on the day of Ellen's trial, as the community gathered to witness the conclusion of a story that had shattered their peaceful town. As expected, Ellen's defense argued that Marion's death had been unintentional, a tragic accident that spiraled out of control. But Burke's investigation had revealed the truth. The planning, the call to Carl Benson, the steps Ellen had taken to hide her mother's death. All of it painted a picture of premeditated malice. Burke testified, recounting every detail of her findings. Every misstep Ellen had tried to cover up, every truth that had eventually come to light. When Ellen took the stand, her appearance was a stark contrast to the confident woman Burke had first met. She looked hollow, broken, a shell of the person she once was. Her voice trembled as she spoke, her words filled with bitterness and regret, but she never fully admitted her guilt. Instead, she painted herself as a victim of her mother's mistakes, of a life spent in someone else's shadow. The jury watched her with a mixture of pity and revulsion, seeing the depths of a resentment that had consumed her whole life. In the end, the verdict was inevitable. Ellen was found guilty of second-degree murder, her sentence a reflection of the calculated cruelty she'd shown in hiding Marion's death. She would spend decades in prison, and Burke knew that even behind bars, Ellen would remain a prisoner of her own bitterness, haunted by the choices she'd made. After the trial, Burke returned to her usual work, but the Tate case lingered in her mind. It was a reminder that some wounds never healed, that some choices left scars that could never be erased. But in the quiet moments, when she walked through Grayson or sat alone at her desk, she thought of Marion's last wish, that her family might find a way to heal, that forgiveness might somehow bridge the gaps left by a lifetime of secrets. One rainy evening, a few weeks after Ellen's sentencing, Burke received a letter. It was from Susan. Inside was a simple note, written in careful, neat handwriting. Dear Detective Burke, thank you for everything you did to bring justice to my mother's memory. I've decided to leave Grayson. I thought it would be difficult, but I feel at peace with my decision. I'll always carry my mother's spirit with me, and I want to live in a way that honors her, free from the darkness of the past. I'm choosing to forgive, not for Ellen's sake, but for my own. Thank you for giving me the strength to find my own path. With gratitude, Susan. As Burke folded the letter, she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, a rare feeling in her line of work. The Tate family story was a sad one, filled with mistakes and regrets, but in Susan there was a glimmer of hope, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of unimaginable pain. As she walked to her car that evening, the rain drizzling softly around her, Burke looked out over the town of Grayson, its streets dark and quiet. She knew that life would move on, that people would eventually forget the Tate family tragedy, their memories softened by time. But for Burke, the case had left a mark, a reminder of the hidden battles people carried within them, and the strength it took to let go. And somewhere in the distance, under the quiet sky, Burke imagined Marion's spirit watching over her family, perhaps finally at peace, knowing that her story had found its ending.